Tonight, we're going to talk about one of the greatest mysteries in human history. A moment when the whole known world, or at least the world that mattered to the people writing things down at the time, simply came apart. Not gradually, not over centuries the way Rome would later fade, but within roughly a generation, sometimes within a single decade, the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean burned. The palaces were abandoned. The writing systems were forgotten. The trade networks that had bound together kingdoms from Egypt to Anatolia to Mycenaean Greece just dissolved. And what came after was a dark age so profound that when Greeks began writing again some 400 years later, they had almost no memory of what had come before. They thought the great walls at Mycenae must have been built by giants. They called them Cyclopean because no ordinary man could have moved those stones. And you know what? You can't really blame them for thinking that, because the world their ancestors had lived in was so utterly gone that it had passed into the realm of myth. Heroes and gods and monsters, the Trojan War, Achilles and Hector. That was what remained when the memory of an actual civilization had been ground down to nothing. So today's video is about what happened, about the collapse itself, about the years leading up to it, about the civilizations that fell and the ones that somehow survived, and about the mystery that historians and archaeologists have been arguing over for more than a century, which is simply this: what caused it? Because there is no single answer. There may never be a single answer, and that's part of what makes it fascinating. So come with me, and we're gonna walk through the ruins of a world that once was. Welcome to the channel. Just quickly before we start, thank you to everyone supporting financially, keeping us ad-free and beholden to nobody but you good people in the audience. If you'd like to join those very fine ranks, check out the pinned comment and the video description. And if that's not for you, no worries at all, just give the video a like, drop a comment, subscribe. It really does help push us out in the algorithm, and I do appreciate every single one. Anyway, let's begin. To understand what was lost in 1177 BC, we have to understand what existed before. And the world of the late Bronze Age, roughly the years from about 1500 to 1200 BC, was something genuinely remarkable. It was, as some historians have put it, the first truly international age. You had a system of great powers, and they knew each other. They corresponded. They traded. They intermarried their royal families. They fought wars and signed treaties, and complained to each other in letters about lazy messengers and delayed shipments of copper. It was, in its own way, a globalized world. Not global in the modern sense, of course, but interconnected across an area that spanned from what is now Iran and Iraq in the east all the way to Greece and Italy in the west, from Egypt in the south up to the mountains of Anatolia, modern Turkey, in the north. And within that space, a handful of great kingdoms had emerged that dominated everything. There was Egypt, of course, at the height of what we call the New Kingdom, ruled by pharaohs whose names still ring down through history. Rameses II, sometimes called Rameses the Great, whose colossal statues you can still visit in Egypt today, whose 70-year reign left monuments across the length of the Nile. There was the Hittite Empire, centered on its capital at Hattusa in the highlands of central Anatolia, an empire whose kings had fought Rameses to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, and then, quite reasonably, decided that maybe negotiation was preferable to more chariots getting smashed to pieces. The resulting treaty, by the way, is the earliest surviving international peace treaty in human history, and a copy of it hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York. Not bad for a document over 3,000 years old. There were the Kassite kings of Babylon down in Mesopotamia. There was the kingdom of Assyria beginning its long rise to power. There was the strange and now largely forgotten kingdom of Mitanni, though by this point Mitanni was on the decline, squeezed between the Hittites and the Assyrians. There were the Mycenaeans in Greece, whose warrior kings ruled from massive fortified citadels at places like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and whose merchants sailed the Mediterranean trading in olive oil and wine and finished goods. There was the merchant kingdom of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a small state but a wealthy one, whose position at the crossroads of trade routes made it one of the great commercial hubs of the age. There was Cyprus, called Alatia in the ancient texts, whose enormous copper mines supplied a metal that was essential for the whole system. And that's the key thing to understand. This was a world of bronze. The name we give the age, the Bronze Age, isn't just archaeological convenience. It describes something absolutely fundamental about the technology and economy that made this civilization possible. Bronze was the metal from which weapons were made, from which armor was made, from which agricultural tools were forged. Bronze plows, bronze sickles, bronze axes. The whole material infrastructure of late Bronze Age life depended on it, and bronze is an ally. You can't just dig it up, you have to make it. And to make it, you need two ingredients, copper and tin, mixed together in roughly the right proportion. Copper you could get in a lot of places, but the great deposits were on Cyprus, giving that small island a significance in the ancient economy far out of proportion to its size. But tin was rare. Tin was the choke point. The nearest major sources of tin to the Mediterranean world were in Afghanistan and Central Asia, thousands of miles away, and the tin had to come overland through a chain of intermediaries, each taking their cut, each of them a potential point of failure in the supply line. Some tin also came from Cornwall in Britain, hauled down through Europe by traders. But wherever it came from far away, and it came at great expense, and everybody needed it. Which meant everybody had to trade. And that trade wasn't casual. It was systematic and enormous. We have physical evidence of it that still amazes archaeologists whenever it turns up. In 1982, off the coast of Uluburun in southern Turkey, divers discovered the wreck of a late Bronze Age merchant ship that had gone down around 1300 BC. What they found in the cargo tells you almost everything you need to know about how connected this world was. There were 10 tons of copper ingots, cast in a distinctive shape called the oxhide ingot because it looked a bit like a stretched-out ox skin. That copper came from Cyprus. There was a ton of tin, coming from further east, possibly from Afghanistan. There was Canaanite pottery and Egyptian jewelry and Mycenaean pottery and Nubian ebony and hippopotamus ivory and elephant tusks and glass ingots in cobalt blue and turquoise and lavender colors that must have been intended for craftsmen in some royal workshop somewhere. There were tortoise shells and ostrich eggshells and a scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian Queen Nefertiti. There were weapons and tools and personal possessions of the crew from at least half a dozen different regions. One ship, one cargo, and in it, the whole Mediterranean. That's not a rare exception either. That's just one of the ships we happened to find because it happened to sink and happened to be preserved and happened to be discovered. Multiply that by the traffic of hundreds of years, and you get some sense of what this trade network actually looked like. It was an enormous, humming, integrated economy that connected every major kingdom of the age and made them, in a very real sense, dependent on each other. The Hittite king couldn't equip his army without tin from far away and copper from Cyprus. The Egyptian pharaoh needed cedar timber from Lebanon for his temples and his ships. The Mycenaean kings needed the same raw materials to maintain their bronze-producing workshops and their whole military elite. And every one of them needed the goods, the luxuries, the finished products that flowed along these networks, because much of what distinguished a king from a commoner in that world was the ability to consume and display exotic materials from far away. The elephant ivory, the lapis lazuli, the perfumed oils, the finely wrought gold jewelry. These weren't just decorations. They were the very stuff of royal identity, the physical signs that a ruler was who they claimed to be. Now, we know all of this in extraordinary detail because these civilizations were literate. They wrote things down, and a good deal of what they wrote has survived. The Egyptians on their temple walls and papyrus scrolls, the Hittites on clay tablets baked into permanence when their palaces later burned, the Mycenaeans in a script we call Linear B, the Ugaritic scribes in their alphabetic cuneiform, the Kassite Babylonians in their traditional Akkadian, all of them producing records that let us reconstruct their politics and their economies, and even the personalities of individual kings and officials. We have the diplomatic archives of the Egyptian court from the reign of Akhenaten, the so-called Amarna letters, in which we can read the correspondence between the great powers as if we were reading a modern email chain. Kings addressing each other as brother. Kings sending gifts and demanding gifts in return. Kings complaining that a shipment of gold arrived lighter than promised, that a promised bride hasn't been sent yet, that so and so isn't returning phone calls, so to speak. It's an intimate glimpse into a diplomatic culture that felt entirely modern in its concerns, even as it operated within a world of chariots and scribes and clay envelopes. And it's this world, this astonishing, interconnected, literate, sophisticated world that would come to an end. Not all at once, not everywhere at the same moment, but within a period of roughly 50 years, from about 1200 to 1150 BC, most of the great cities of this system would be destroyed. Most of the great kingdoms would collapse. The trade networks would break. The writing systems would be forgotten in many places, and a darkness would descend over the eastern Mediterranean that would last for centuries. So how does something like that happen? How does an entire civilization, or rather a whole family of civilizations, come apart in a generation? That is the great mystery of 1177 BC. To understand how it fell, we first need to understand just how confident these people were that it wouldn't. Because that's one of the strange, almost unsettling things about the late Bronze Age collapse. In the decades leading up to it, there's very little sense in the surviving sources that anyone saw it coming. The kings were still building their monuments. The scribes were still keeping their records. The merchants were still loading their ships. The diplomats were still exchanging their letters. Everything looked, from the inside, like business as usual. Perhaps slightly more troubled business than before, perhaps with more complaints about pirates and grain shortages, but still recognizably the same world it had always been. Right up until the moment it wasn't. So let's paint the picture properly of what was happening at the beginning of the 12th century BC. Let's start in Egypt, because Egypt is where we have the best written record of what came next, and because Egypt is the one great power that would survive, even if only just. The pharaoh at this critical moment was Rameses III, and he came to the throne around 1186 BC. He was, in many ways, a man out of time. He deliberately styled himself after his more famous predecessor, Rameses II, taking the same throne name, imitating the same monumental building program, presenting himself as the continuation of a great tradition. And in some ways, he succeeded. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor, is one of the best preserved of all Egyptian temples, and on its walls he left an account of the events of his reign that is, quite frankly, one of the most important historical documents in the world. Because it's on those walls that we get the most detailed description we have of what contemporaries actually saw happening around them. And what they saw was terrifying. The inscription describes the events of Rameses III's 8th regnal year, which corresponds to 1177 BC, the date that gives our story its name. And it tells us this. The foreign lands made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were on the move, scattered in war. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amaru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which had never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Tijeka, Shekelesh, Denian, and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the lands as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. Now, sit with that for a moment. Because the pharaoh is telling us, in his own words, that a coalition of peoples he calls collectively the Sea Peoples had swept down from somewhere, destroying the great powers of the Bronze Age system as they came. Hatti, that's the Hittite Empire. Alashia, that's Cyprus. Arzawa was a kingdom in western Anatolia. Carchemish was one of the great Hittite provincial capitals. Amru was a small kingdom in what is now Lebanon and Syria. All of them, according to this text, cut off at one time. Now, historians have argued for over a century about how literally to take this account. Rameses had every reason to exaggerate the threat, because he was about to describe how he defeated it, and the greater the threat, the greater his victory. But the destruction he describes wasn't invented. The archaeology confirms it. Hattusa, the great Hittite capital, was burned to the ground around this time and never reoccupied. Ugarit, the merchant kingdom on the Syrian coast, was destroyed so completely that its final letters to allies asking for help were still in the ovens where they'd been baked hard for delivery when the fires consumed everything. The Mycenaean palaces at Pylos and Mycenae and Tiryns and Thebes were all destroyed within roughly the same period. Something enormous and catastrophic was happening across the eastern Mediterranean, and the Egyptian account is our best surviving contemporary description of it. But who were these sea peoples? That's a question historians have been trying to answer for 150 years, and honestly, we're still not entirely sure. The names Rameses gives us, the Peliset, the Tijeka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh, we can identify some of them with reasonable confidence, and others remain almost completely mysterious. The Peliset are almost certainly the people who would eventually settle in the coastal region of Canaan and give their name to the land of Palestine. In the Bible, they appear as the Philistines. The Denian may be connected to the Danans, one of Homer's names for the Greeks in the Iliad. The Shekelesh may be connected to Sicily, the Sherdan to Sardinia, though whether those groups came from those islands or gave their name to them later is impossible to say with certainty. The Egyptian reliefs show these people vividly. Some wear feathered headdresses that look almost like Native American war bonnets. Others wear horned helmets. They have distinctive clothing and weapons. They came with their families in ox carts. This wasn't a raid. This was a migration. Men, women, children, and animals, an entire population on the move, looking for somewhere new to live. And that's the thing. The Sea Peoples weren't an army in any conventional sense. They weren't invaders sent by some rival kingdom. They appear to have been what we might now call a displaced population, refugees perhaps, driven from wherever their homelands had been by some crisis we can't fully identify, moving in enormous numbers through a Mediterranean world that was already under stress and that couldn't absorb them. When they arrived at the borders of a kingdom, that kingdom faced a choice: fight them, absorb them, or fall to them. And what the Egyptian and other records tell us is that quite a few kingdoms fell. Rameses III's account then describes the great battles that stopped them. There were two, in fact, according to his inscriptions. One was fought on land, somewhere in the Nile Delta region, and one was fought at sea, in what may be the first depicted naval battle in human history. The relief on the walls of Medinet Habu shows Egyptian ships engaging the vessels of the Sea Peoples in close combat, with archers on the Egyptian ships raining arrows down on the invaders, while Egyptian troops on the shore prevent them from landing. It's an extraordinary image. And whether we take Rameses at his word about the totality of his victory or not, the essential outcome is clear. Egypt survived. The Sea Peoples were prevented from settling in the Nile Delta. Egypt remained, for another century at least, the great civilization it had always been. Though the kingdom that emerged from these events was a diminished one, and within a generation the new kingdom of Egypt would itself be sliding into decline, that's a story for another time. But look at the geography of what Rameses tells us happened. The great powers to Egypt's north, all of them wiped out. Hatti destroyed. Ugarit destroyed. Elashia, Cyprus, either destroyed or so badly damaged that it fell out of the historical record for centuries. The Mycenaean world, though not mentioned directly by name in Rameses' inscription, we know from archaeology fell at essentially the same time. Even in places that Rameses doesn't mention, like Kassite Babylon, we see disruption and decline in the same period. It's not just the Sea Peoples destroying one civilization. It's an entire integrated system coming apart, from Greece to Anatolia to Syria to Mesopotamia. And this brings us back to the great mystery, because the Sea Peoples on their own don't really explain it. They can't explain it. For one thing, the Sea Peoples themselves came from somewhere. What drove them out of wherever they'd been? For another thing, the destruction of these various kingdoms doesn't look like it was all done by the same people. When you look at the archaeological evidence, the picture is much more complicated than a single wave of invaders sweeping through the region. Take Hattusa, the Hittite capital. It burned. But when archaeologists study the burn layer carefully, they find that many of the treasures that would normally have been in the royal palace were already gone before the fire. The city seems to have been evacuated, or partially evacuated, before it was destroyed. The great archives of clay tablets, kept in what were essentially the government offices of the empire, they're still there because clay tablets are heavy and hard to move. But the portable wealth, the gold, the ceremonial objects, they've been taken away, which suggests that whoever burned Hattusa did so after the people who mattered had already fled. That doesn't look like a surprise invasion. That looks like the collapse of a state, followed by opportunistic destruction. The Hittites didn't disappear entirely. Fragments of the empire survived in the south, in what we call the Neo-Hittite states, cities like Carchemish and Karat, where Hittite culture and even Hittite writing continued for another few centuries. But the imperial center, the great Hittite kingdom itself, was simply gone. Or take the Mycenaean palaces in Greece. They were all destroyed within a fairly narrow window of time, but the pattern of destruction varies from site to site. Some were burned, some were abandoned. At Pylos, in the southwestern Peloponnese, we have some of the most poignant evidence of all. The Linear B tablets from Pylos were baked hard, and thus preserved for us to read 3,000 years later in the fire that destroyed the palace. Among those tablets is a series of records about coastal defense preparations. The palace administrators were tracking rowers being sent to man ships, watchers being posted along the coast, offerings being made to the gods presumably for protection. Something was clearly happening. They knew something was coming. And then the palace burned, and whatever they were preparing for came anyway. But what came? The tablets don't tell us. They just stop. All Mycenaean writing stops. And it doesn't start again for 400 years, when Greeks begin using an entirely different script borrowed from the Phoenicians, which we now call the Greek alphabet, the ancestor of every alphabet used in Europe today. So we have this pattern all across the eastern Mediterranean of destruction, abandonment, and disruption happening more or less simultaneously across a wide area, affecting societies that were quite different from each other but connected by the same trade networks and the same broad cultural system. And no single explanation, whether it's the Sea Peoples or anything else, quite accounts for all of it. So what does? Well, let's start pulling apart some of the theories that historians and archaeologists have put forward over the years. Because there have been a lot of them, and each has its passionate defenders, and each captures some aspect of the truth without fully explaining the whole. And when you look at them all together, you start to see something interesting, which is that maybe the answer isn't any single one of them at all. The oldest and simplest theory is the one we've already touched on, and that's the invasion theory. The Sea Peoples came, they saw, they burned everything down, end of story. It's a satisfying explanation because it's clean and it names a villain. And for a long time, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was the dominant explanation. Rameses tells us the Sea Peoples destroyed everything. Rameses was there. Rameses knew what he was talking about. Case closed. But as archaeology developed and as more sites were carefully excavated, the picture began to complicate. Because the Sea Peoples, whoever they were, don't seem to have been present at every site that was destroyed. And in some cases, the destruction happened before the Sea Peoples could plausibly have arrived. And in other cases, the archaeological evidence for who exactly did the destroying is thin or ambiguous or contested. The Sea Peoples were part of the story. Almost certainly they were part of the story. But they can't be the whole story, because the story is bigger than they are. So then, in the middle of the 20th century, another theory started to gain ground. And that was the earthquake theory. The idea here is that the eastern Mediterranean sits along a network of geological fault lines, and that during the period between roughly 1225 and 1175 BC, there appears to have been what geologists call an earthquake storm. This is a phenomenon where stress released along one section of a fault triggers stress release along connected sections, producing a cascade of earthquakes over a period of decades. And the archaeological evidence at several sites does show what looks very much like earthquake damage. Walls collapsed inward. Skeletons found crushed beneath fallen debris in postures that suggest people were caught by surprise. Buildings toppled without any of the burn evidence you'd expect if the destruction was caused by human action. At places like Mycenae itself, at Tiryns, at Medea, at Troy, we see this kind of damage. And it makes sense. It's the kind of thing that could genuinely happen. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically active. Earthquakes have devastated cities in that region throughout history. There's no reason to think 1200 BC was any different in that regard. But again, earthquakes alone can't explain what happened. For one thing, cities recover from earthquakes. They always have. Even devastating earthquakes don't typically produce civilizational collapse. Look at Lisbon in 1755, essentially leveled by a massive earthquake followed by a tsunami. Portugal did not collapse. Lisbon was rebuilt. Look at Tokyo in 1923, devastated by the Great Kanto earthquake, hundreds of thousands dead. Japan did not collapse. Tokyo was rebuilt. Cities and states are resilient to earthquakes because they have the resources and the will to rebuild. What earthquakes can do is contribute to broader crises. They can weaken already fragile states. They can disrupt trade routes at critical moments. They can be one blow among several that a society ultimately can't recover from. So earthquakes might be part of the picture, but they can't be the whole picture either. Then there's the climate theory, and this is one that's gained enormous ground in recent decades as our tools for reconstructing ancient climates have gotten better. The evidence here is genuinely striking. Scientists have been able to reconstruct the climate of the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age using a variety of methods. And what they've found is that a period of severe and prolonged drought appears to have hit the region beginning around 1200 BC and lasting for approximately 300 years. That's not a bad harvest. That's not a difficult decade. That's a fundamental shift in the climate that would have made the entire agricultural basis of these societies unsustainable. Pollen cores from lakes in the region show a dramatic shift toward drought-tolerant vegetation. Isotope analysis of cave formations and marine sediments tells the same story. Something changed in the climate, and it changed for the worse, and it stayed changed for a very long time. Now think about what a 300-year drought does to a Bronze Age agricultural civilization. These were societies whose economies depended entirely on grain. Their tax systems were based on grain. Their armies were fed on grain. Their populations were sustained by grain. And the great palace centers, whether in Mycenaean Greece or the Hittite Empire, functioned as redistribution systems in which grain was collected from the surrounding countryside, stored in massive palace granaries, and then redistributed to soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and other dependents of the palace. It was, in a real sense, a command economy centered on grain. And if the grain doesn't come in, that entire system breaks down. The soldiers can't be paid. The craftsmen can't be fed. The dependents of the palace start looking elsewhere for survival, or they turn on the palace itself. And the population as a whole becomes desperate. The evidence for widespread grain shortage in the years leading up to the collapse is actually pretty striking when you look at the surviving documents. We have letters from the last decades of the Hittite Empire that talk about desperate need for grain. The Hittite kings were writing to Egypt begging for shipments. There's a letter from the Hittite king Suppiluliuma II referring to famine as a matter of life and death. There are Egyptian records of grain being sent to the Hittites specifically to address hunger. The great Merneptah stele, which is another Egyptian source from a few decades before the main collapse, records a shipment of grain sent to the Hittites in these words, that I might cause the land of Hatti to live. That's an Egyptian pharaoh describing his grain shipments as literally keeping an entire empire alive. That tells you something about the scale of the food crisis these societies were facing. And then think about what grain shortage does socially. It creates refugees. It creates migration. It creates the very kind of population movement that might explain the Sea Peoples. Because remember, we don't actually know where the Sea Peoples came from. Various theories place their origin variously in the Western Mediterranean, in the Aegean, in Anatolia itself, in the Balkans. But what if some of them, at least, were themselves refugees from the drought? What if the collapse of agricultural conditions in some region we haven't yet identified drove populations out of their homelands, sent them southward and eastward looking for food and land, and turned them into the invading force that swept through the collapsing kingdoms? That would tie the two theories together. Climate change causes migration. Migration puts pressure on already stressed societies. Already stressed societies collapse when the migrants arrive. It's an elegant explanation, and it may well be at least partly true. But even the climate theory, powerful as it is, doesn't quite explain everything on its own, because different regions were affected differently. Egypt, which depended on the Nile flood, which is fed by rains in the highlands of Ethiopia thousands of miles away, would have been less directly affected by drought in the eastern Mediterranean. And yet Egypt still declined, just more slowly. Mesopotamia, watered by the Tigris and Euphrates, would similarly have been buffered against local drought. And yet Mesopotamian civilization also went into a period of decline and disruption during these years. So climate matters, but it's not the whole story either. Then there's a theory that gained real traction in the second half of the 20th century, and that's the systems collapse theory. This is the idea that what happened at 1177 BC wasn't the failure of any single society, but the failure of an entire interconnected system. Remember what we talked about in the first section. This was a globalized world by the standards of the time. Every major kingdom was economically dependent on the others. They needed tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, timber from Lebanon, grain from Egypt, luxury goods from every corner of the known world. That interconnection made them all richer than they could have been on their own. But it also made them vulnerable in ways they didn't fully understand. Because when one part of the system breaks, it affects every other part. And when several parts of the system break more or less at once, the whole thing can come apart with astonishing speed. Think about what happens if the tin supply from Central Asia gets cut off, maybe because of instability along the trade routes, maybe because of drought driving nomadic populations to raid the caravans. Suddenly nobody in the eastern Mediterranean can make bronze anymore, or at least they can't make enough of it. That means fewer weapons for the armies, fewer tools for the farmers, fewer objects to trade. That in turn means the trade networks start carrying less, which means every merchant, every port city, every kingdom that depended on trade taxes starts losing revenue. That in turn means less money for the palace administrations, less patronage for craftsmen, less capacity to maintain armies and public works. Now add drought to that. Now add earthquakes. Now add refugee movements. Now add opportunistic raids by pirates who have noticed that the great powers are looking weaker than before. Each one of these things is manageable on its own. Any given kingdom in the late Bronze Age had faced drought before, or earthquakes before, or migration before. But all of them together, hitting simultaneously across a system that was already stretched thin by its own complexity. That's a different matter entirely. That's the kind of thing that causes collapse. And this leads to what I think is probably the closest thing we have to a satisfactory answer to the mystery of 1177 BC. It's what historians sometimes call a perfect storm, or in Eric Klein's memorable phrase from his famous book on the subject, a complexity collapse. The late Bronze Age didn't fall because of one thing. It fell because of many things happening at once, each of them reinforcing the others, in a system that was too interconnected and too fragile to absorb multiple simultaneous shocks. That's an answer that lacks the drama of a single villain or a single catastrophe, but it may be closer to the truth than any of the simpler explanations. Let's take a closer look at what a system's collapse actually looks like from the inside. Because this is where things get really interesting, and where the archaeological evidence starts to tell us a story that goes beyond simple destruction. Let's zoom in on one of the best documented cases we have, which is the collapse of the merchant kingdom of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. Because Ugarit's fall gives us a window into what these final years actually felt like for the people living through them, and it's a genuinely haunting story. Ugarit was, in the late 13th century BC, one of the great commercial hubs of the eastern Mediterranean. It sat on the coast of what is now Syria, at a natural harbor location that made it a perfect meeting point for trade coming from all directions. Goods from Egypt came up through the Levant. Goods from Anatolia came down through the mountain passes. Goods from Cyprus came across the sea. Goods from Mesopotamia came overland through the great caravan routes. All of it passed through Ugarit at some point or other, and the kings of Ugarit grew wealthy on the taxes and duties they collected. The city itself, When you visit its ruins today at a site called Ras Shamra, was a sophisticated urban center with palace buildings, temples, elite residential quarters, workshops, and warehouses. It had its own writing system, an alphabetic cuneiform that was actually simpler and more elegant than the traditional Akkadian script used elsewhere in the region. It had its own literature, some of it now famous among scholars of ancient Near Eastern religion, including epic poems that give us insight into Canaanite mythology that would later influence the Hebrew Bible. It was, in short, a small but sophisticated and prosperous state, plugged into every major trade network of its time. Now here's the thing. Ugarit didn't collapse gradually. When you look at the archaeological evidence, the destruction of Ugarit happened suddenly and completely. The city was burned, the palaces were sacked, the population was killed or driven away. And after that, Ugarit was simply never reoccupied. Not for centuries, not in any meaningful sense ever. The site sat abandoned, its ruins buried by the accumulating dust of millennia, until French archaeologists started digging there in 1929. And what those archaeologists found preserved in the destruction layers of Ugarit is one of the most remarkable historical documents we have from the whole late Bronze Age collapse, and it comes to us in the form of clay tablets that were literally in the process of being written when the city fell. You see, clay tablets are strange things. When they're fresh, when they've just been written on, they're soft. They need to be baked or dried before they become permanent. In normal circumstances, the tablets that got baked hard were the ones deemed important enough to preserve. Everyday correspondence was often written on tablets that were only air-dried, meaning they would eventually crumble away. But here's the paradox. In a catastrophic destruction event, in a fire, all the tablets get baked hard. The important ones and the everyday ones alike. Everything in the archives, everything on the desk of a scribe when the flames arrived, all of it gets preserved permanently by the very disaster that ended the civilization that produced it. So we get, in cases like Ugarit, a snapshot of the last moments before the end. Letters that were being written when the attackers arrived. Letters that were sitting in the outbox waiting to be sent when the city fell. It's like finding the emails on someone's screen at the moment they died. There's an intimacy to it that's almost overwhelming when you actually sit with it. And among these final letters from Ugarit are some genuinely chilling documents. There's a letter from the king of Ugarit, whose name was Amurapi, to the king of Alashia, Cyprus. And in this letter, Amurapi is clearly in a state of near panic. He writes that enemy ships have already been sighted, that his own army is off in the land of Hatti, helping the Hittites deal with their own crisis, that his own fleet is stationed in the land of Lucca, that's southwestern Anatolia, and cannot come to defend his coast, that his cities are essentially defenseless. And the whole tone of the letter is one of desperate appeal. Please send help. Please send information. Please tell me what's happening. And then the response from the king of Alashia, which we also have preserved, is essentially, we have our own problems, our own coasts are being attacked, we can't help you. And then Ugarit falls, and the letters stop, and the city dies. There's another letter from the same period, this one from the general of Ugarit's army to the king, and it complains that all the ships have been sent away and the coast is empty. There's a letter from a scribe reporting the arrival of hostile ships. There are letters requesting that food supplies be redirected from one place to another. What emerges is a picture of a state that is desperately trying to coordinate a defense against an enemy it can barely see, while its resources are stretched to breaking point, while its allies are just as beleaguered as it is, and while the whole system it depends on is unraveling around it. And this happens, in Ugarit's case, within a very short window of time. The letters suggest weeks or months of crisis, not years, and then the fire, and then silence. Now that's Ugarit. And Ugarit's story is dramatic and specific and knowable in a way that most of these collapses aren't. But when you look elsewhere, at other cities that fell around the same time, you see similar patterns. Not always with the same specific evidence, because not every city preserved its final correspondence the way Ugarit did. But with the same sense of a system being overwhelmed by simultaneous crises it couldn't manage. Let's move to the Hittite Empire, because the Hittite collapse is arguably the most consequential of all these events, and it deserves its own careful look. The Hittite Empire, at its peak, had been one of the great powers of the ancient world. Its capital at Hattusa was a massive fortified city in the highlands of central Anatolia, positioned in a naturally defensible location, surrounded by cliffs and gorges. Its kings had fought Rameses II to a standstill and negotiated as equals with the pharaohs of Egypt. Its empire had at various times controlled or dominated most of Anatolia, much of northern Syria, and had exercised influence into what is now Lebanon and Israel. It had a sophisticated legal system, complex diplomatic protocols, and a vast archive of clay tablets in multiple languages, since the Hittite court operated in a genuinely multilingual environment. This was an empire that had lasted in one form or another for around 500 years, and yet by around 1180 BC it was gone, not diminished, not weakened, gone. The capital burned, the imperial administration vanished. The very memory of the Hittite Empire faded so completely that when the Bible was written some centuries later, it remembered the Hittites only as some vague people who had once lived in the hills of Canaan, a distant and misty presence entirely disconnected from the great empire they had once been. It took modern archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries to rediscover the Hittites, to decipher their writing, and to reconstruct the story of what they had once been. So what happened to them? The picture we can reconstruct from the archaeological and textual evidence is complex and troubling. In the final decades of the Hittite Empire, we see clear signs of stress. There are references in the surviving texts to famine, to grain shortages, to political unrest. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, appears to have been a competent ruler dealing with an increasingly impossible situation. He was fighting military campaigns on multiple fronts. He was trying to secure grain supplies from Egypt. He was dealing with a rebellious province in western Anatolia. And we know from his own inscriptions that he actually won some significant naval battles in the years before the final collapse, including what may have been the first naval battle mentioned in the Hittite records, fought against ships coming from Cyprus. So the Hittites weren't going quietly. They were fighting to the end. But here's the strange part. When Hattusa fell, when the city was finally destroyed, the evidence suggests that it had already been substantially abandoned. The great archives are still there, because clay tablets are heavy and impractical to move. But the treasures of the royal palace, the ceremonial objects, the personal wealth of the elite, all of that appears to have been removed before the fires came. Which means either the Hittites had time to evacuate the important stuff before the enemy arrived, or the royal court itself had already left and moved somewhere else, taking what they could carry before the city was burned by whoever finally destroyed it. Either possibility is interesting. In the first case, we're looking at a controlled retreat. In the second, we're looking at something more like state failure, where the government essentially abandons its capital, and the abandoned city is later destroyed by opportunistic attackers. The Hittite state didn't quite disappear all at once, though. Fragments of it survived, particularly in the southern parts of the empire. Cities like Carchemish continue to be ruled by kings claiming descent from the Hittite royal line for another few centuries. These so-called Neo-Hittite states preserved Hittite culture and the Hittite hieroglyphic script for several hundred years after the fall of Hattusa. But they were small kingdoms, provincial powers at best, nothing like the empire that had come before. And they too eventually were absorbed by the rising Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th and 8th centuries BC. The Hittite Empire, as a great power, was simply gone. And what filled the vacuum in Anatolia? For centuries, essentially nothing. Central Anatolia entered a genuine dark age. The population appears to have declined dramatically. Urban settlement all but vanished. Writing disappeared entirely from the region. When we next see the plateau in the historical record, centuries later, it's populated by peoples the Greeks would call the Phrygians, whose relationship to the previous Hittite population is unclear, but who were, as far as we can tell, essentially newcomers building on what was by then an empty landscape. An entire imperial civilization, with all its literature and administration and monumental architecture, had passed away, leaving essentially no memory of itself in the land it had once ruled. Now let's turn our attention west, across the Aegean to the Mycenaean world. Because if the Hittite collapse was dramatic, the Mycenaean collapse was in some ways even more thorough. And it left an even longer shadow over subsequent history, because it produced the specific dark age from which classical Greek civilization would eventually emerge, and the specific cultural memory that would generate the epics of Homer. The Mycenaean civilization takes its name from the greatest of its citadels, Mycenae, which sits on a hilltop in the northeastern Peloponnese, that great southern peninsula of Greece. Mycenae was the seat of a warrior aristocracy whose culture had come to dominate mainland Greece by around 1600 BC and would remain the dominant civilization of the region until the collapse we're discussing. And when you visit Mycenae today, when you climb up to those ruins, the thing that strikes you immediately is the sheer scale of the fortifications. The walls are made of stones so massive that no ordinary human strength could have lifted them into place. The main gate, the famous Lion Gate, is topped by a triangular relief showing two lions or lionesses flanking a central column. It's one of the earliest monumental sculptures in European history, and it's genuinely impressive, even after 3,500 years. When later Greeks came back to this site, they simply couldn't imagine that human beings had built such walls. They attributed the construction to the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of their mythology. Hence the term Cyclopean masonry, which archaeologists still use for this style of construction. Mycenae wasn't alone. It was the greatest of a network of similar citadels scattered across the Greek mainland. There was Tiryns, not far from Mycenae, another walled fortress town with equally massive fortifications. There was Pylos, in the southwestern Peloponnese, whose palace was excavated in the 20th century and yielded the archive of Linear B tablets that has given us so much information about Mycenaean administration. There was Thebes in central Greece. There was Iolcos in Thessaly. There was Athens, though Athens at this point was a relatively minor settlement compared to what it would later become. And each of these citadels was the seat of a king, called in the Linear B tablets a wanax, and each king ruled over a surrounding territory whose agricultural output was tightly controlled and administered through the palace. This was, in structure, quite similar to the Hittite system, and indeed to most of the Bronze Age palace states. Grain came in from the countryside, was stored in palace granaries, and was redistributed to soldiers, artisans, priests, and other palace dependents. Craft production was centered on palace workshops, where scribes tracked the movement of raw materials and finished goods with obsessive precision. We have Linear B tablets recording things like how many chariot wheels were in storage, how much bronze was being distributed to individual smiths, how many rowers were being levied from which villages. It's the paperwork of an early bureaucratic state, preserved for us because the palaces burned and baked the tablets hard. The Mycenaeans were also, importantly, a maritime and militarized culture. Their pottery, distinctive and easily identifiable, has been found across the eastern Mediterranean and even into the western Mediterranean. Mycenaean traders reached Cyprus, Egypt, the Levant, southern Italy, Sicily. They may have reached even further. They were also raiders and warriors. The Iliad, composed several hundred years after the collapse, remembers them as a warrior aristocracy engaged in constant warfare. And while the specific events of the Trojan War, as Homer tells them, are almost certainly legendary, the underlying picture of Mycenaean society, as one where great lords led war bands in raids and battles, is probably not far from the historical reality. This was a culture that measured a man's worth by his prowess in combat, that celebrated him in bronze armor and horsehair helmets, that placed weapons and gold masks in his grave when he died. When Heinrich Schliemann dug at Mycenae in the 1870s, he uncovered graves so full of gold that he famously telegraphed back that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. He was wrong about the date, and about Agamemnon, since those particular graves were centuries older than the Trojan War, but he wasn't wrong about the world he had uncovered. This was a culture of gold and bronze and glory, and this whole world went up in flames. The great Mycenaean palaces were destroyed in a series of events between roughly 1200 and 1150 BC, not all at exactly the same moment. Some fell earlier, some later. But within that half-century, essentially all of them were gone. Pylos was destroyed by fire around 1200 BC and never rebuilt. The palace at Thebes fell around the same time. Mycenae and Tiryns were both destroyed, though there's evidence of some reoccupation at both sites for a period afterwards, before final abandonment came. And when it was over, the Mycenaean world simply ceased to exist as a civilization. The palaces weren't rebuilt. The Linear B script was forgotten so completely that when Greeks began to write again centuries later, they had to borrow an entirely different alphabet from Phoenician traders. The centralized economy of palace administration disappeared and was replaced by something much more localized and much less sophisticated. The population declined dramatically. Many settlements were simply abandoned. Some scholars estimate that the population of Greece dropped by 70 or even 80% in the century after the collapse. That's not decline, that's catastrophe. What replaced it was what we call the Greek Dark Age, sometimes also the Sub-Mycenaean or the Geometric period, depending on which century you're looking at. This Dark Age lasted for around 400 years, from roughly 1150 BC to around 750 BC, when we start to see the emergence of the classical Greek world we know from later history. During those 400 years, essentially no monumental architecture was built in Greece. Writing disappeared entirely. Long-distance trade contracted dramatically. Political organization reverted to small, localized chiefdoms. It was a genuinely dark period in the sense that we know very little about it, because the people living through it left very few written records or impressive material remains. When later Greeks looked back at their own history, they had almost no memory of this period. What they had instead was the legendary material that would eventually be crystallized in the Homeric epics. And even that legendary material referred not to the Dark Age itself, but to the world before it, the Mycenaean world, dimly remembered as an age of heroes, and now understood to be beyond reach. Now, what caused the Mycenaean collapse specifically? The same question we're asking about the Late Bronze Age as a whole, and the answers we can give are similarly complicated. We do have some specific evidence that suggests certain contributing factors. The Pylos tablets, as I mentioned earlier, show us a palace preparing for some kind of coastal threat in its final days. They record the assignment of watchers to coastal positions, the deployment of rowers, offerings to the gods presumably for protection. Something was coming, and the Pylos administrators knew it was coming, and they were doing what they could to prepare. Whether what came was the Sea People specifically, or some other maritime raiders, or some entirely different threat, we simply can't say. But something came, and the palace burned, and the world it administered came apart. There's also evidence that suggests internal social conflict was part of the picture. Some archaeologists have argued that the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces looks in some cases more like internal revolt than external invasion. The palaces are burned, but the surrounding settlements are not. The wealth of the palace is destroyed rather than looted. This is a pattern that can suggest peasant uprising against the ruling class rather than an external enemy who would presumably have wanted to carry away the treasure. Whether this interpretation is correct is genuinely contested. But it's plausible enough that we can't dismiss it, and it fits with what we know about the extraordinary demands the palace economy placed on its subjects. If the palace was demanding grain from starving peasants during years of drought, if it was conscripting men for military service they didn't want to perform, if it was extracting resources from a population that could no longer afford to give them up, then at some point the population might have decided to take matters into their own hands. And an unpopular palace, undefended because its own soldiers had given up on it, would be a very easy target for whoever showed up with weapons and grievances. And here we come back to that fundamental point about systems collapse. The Mycenaean palace economy was, in its way, extraordinarily productive. It generated wealth. It supported a warrior aristocracy. It sustained sophisticated craft production. But it was also very fragile. Because it depended on the palace's ability to extract resources from the surrounding countryside, and that ability depended in turn on the palace's legitimacy and coercive power. Take away the legitimacy, take away the coercive power, and the whole thing falls apart very quickly. The palaces weren't just economic centers. They were the essential nodes of a very specific kind of political and economic organization. When they went, they took with them not just their own buildings, but the entire system of administration and redistribution that made Mycenaean civilization work. And what emerged afterward wasn't a Mycenaean world without palaces. It was something fundamentally different, a world of subsistence farmers and small communities, without writing, without long-distance trade, without any of the elaborate structures that had characterized the earlier civilization. And this is one of the things that makes the late Bronze Age collapse so distinctive as a historical event. Because in most cases of civilizational decline, what happens is that one political order is replaced by another. The Roman Empire falls, and eventually various Germanic kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire arise from its ruins. The Han dynasty falls, and eventually new dynasties arise in China to reunify what had been fragmented. Civilization continues, even if in altered form. But at the end of the late Bronze Age in Greece, in Anatolia, and to a lesser extent elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, civilization itself seems to have partially retreated. The complex forms of social organization that had existed before, the writing systems, the palace administrations, the elaborate craft production, the long-distance trade networks, all of this simply disappeared. And what came after was something poorer, simpler, and much less connected. The clock didn't just get reset. In some ways, it got broken. Let's step back for a moment and think about what it would have actually been like to live through this. Because so far we've been talking about civilizations and systems and trade networks, all of these grand abstractions, and it's easy to forget that all of this was happening to actual human beings. People who woke up in the morning and had breakfast and went to work and had children and worried about the future, just like people do today. And what these people experienced over the course of 2 or 3 generations was the collapse of the only world they had ever known. Try to imagine what that would feel like. Try to imagine growing up as the grandchild of someone who had lived in a wealthy palace city and finding yourself scratching subsistence from a small patch of land, unable to read the writing on the ruined walls around you, with no idea what your ancestors had actually done for a living or how they had built the structures whose remains you passed every day. That's the human experience of civilizational collapse, and it's genuinely difficult to comprehend from our modern vantage point. Let's try to imagine a specific case. Let's imagine a young man growing up in Pylos, in the southwestern Peloponnese, in the years around 1210 BC. His grandfather has told him stories about the great days of the palace, about the Wanax and his court, about the ships that came from across the sea bringing goods from Egypt and Cyprus. His father works as a bronze smith in one of the palace workshops, producing weapons and tools according to specifications sent down from the palace scribes. Their family has a house in the town, has enough to eat, has a place in the community. And then things start to change. The rains fail one year, then they fail again the next year. The palace still demands its usual tribute of grain from the countryside, but the countryside can't provide it. There are rumors of unrest in the outlying villages. There are refugees appearing at the gates, driven from their homes by hunger. The father tells the son that things will get better, that the palace will find a way, that this has happened before and things always recover. And for a while, things do get better. There's another good year, then another failure. Then reports from traveling merchants about troubles further east, about cities being attacked, about ships full of desperate warriors appearing on coastlines that had been peaceful for centuries. The father dies. The son takes over the family workshop. He starts training his own son in the trade of bronze smithing. And then one day, ships appear off the coast. Now this is speculation, of course. We can't know the specifics of any individual experience. But we can be reasonably confident about the broad outlines of what people would have gone through because the archaeological and textual evidence tells us. There would have been years of increasing difficulty, grain shortages, rising prices, political tension, refugees, rumors of disaster elsewhere, everything that we associate with a slow-motion crisis unfolding over years or decades. And then the crisis would suddenly become acute. The ships would appear. The palace would fall. and the survivors would find themselves in a completely transformed world within a very short period of time. Their livelihoods gone, their leaders dead or fled, their communities scattered, and no one to explain what had happened or what would come next. What would people have done? Well, we have some evidence for this too. In many places, when the palace centers fell, people moved to more defensible locations. In Greece, we see settlement patterns shift toward hilltops and away from the coasts and plains. People retreated to positions where they could see attackers coming and where they had some hope of defending themselves. In other cases, people migrated, sometimes over quite long distances. There's genetic and archaeological evidence for population movements around the Mediterranean during this period, with groups moving from their original homelands to new territories where they could establish themselves. The Philistines are one clear example. They appear in the archaeological record in the coastal region of Canaan around this time, bringing with them a material culture that looks strongly influenced by Mycenaean traditions. They were quite plausibly part of that broader movement of peoples that the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, refugees from the collapsing world of the Eastern Mediterranean who found new homes in what had been the periphery of the older system. The Philistines would become important later in biblical history as the great enemies of the early Israelites, but their origin lies in this moment of Bronze Age catastrophe. And this leads us to another important point about the collapse, which is that it wasn't purely destructive. New societies emerged from the wreckage. Some of them were very different from what had come before. The Philistines are one example, the Israelites are another. Because it's during this period, roughly the 12th century BC, that we start to see the emergence in the highlands of Canaan of the small settlements that would eventually coalesce into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now, the origin of the Israelites is a hugely contested topic in modern archaeology and biblical studies, and I'm not going to try to settle it here. But whatever the specific story, the emergence of these highland settlements happens against the backdrop of the collapse of the older Canaanite city-state system, which had itself been part of the late Bronze Age palatial economy. The great Canaanite city-states like Hazor and Megiddo and Lachish had been Egyptian vassals during the late Bronze Age, integrated into the international system that connected the Eastern Mediterranean. When that system fell apart, the Canaanite cities went into decline as well, and new populations emerged in the previously marginal highlands. Whether these new populations were entirely new arrivals or displaced Canaanites moving away from the coastal cities, or some combination, is exactly what the debate is about. But the underlying pattern is clear. The collapse of the old order created space for new orders to emerge. The Phoenicians are another example, and a particularly striking one, because the Phoenicians, whose great cities of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos sat on the coast of what is now Lebanon, actually did rather well out of the late Bronze Age collapse. Their cities had been part of the older Canaanite civilization, but they had specialized in maritime trade, and when the older trade networks broke down, they were positioned to take over. In the centuries after the collapse, Phoenician traders would gradually rebuild long-distance maritime trade in the Mediterranean, eventually extending their networks all the way to the Western Mediterranean and beyond. They would found colonies in Spain, in North Africa, in Sicily and Sardinia. Their alphabet, developed from earlier Canaanite writing traditions, would be adopted by the Greeks and would eventually become the ancestor of every alphabet used in Europe today, and indeed of most alphabets used in the world. So the Phoenicians represent a kind of continuity across the collapse, a maritime tradition that survived the destruction of the palace economies and eventually thrived in the new environment. It's worth remembering that not everyone was ruined by what happened. Some people, some communities, some cultures found new opportunities in the rubble. And Egypt too, as I mentioned earlier, survived. Though survival is a relative term. The Egypt that emerged from the crisis was not the Egypt that had entered it. The New Kingdom, that great period of Egyptian imperial power that had reached its peak under Rameses II, went into a slow decline after Rameses III. His successors were less capable. The empire in Canaan and Nubia was gradually lost. Internal political tensions increased. The high priests of Ammon at Thebes became effectively independent rulers of Upper Egypt, while the pharaohs in the delta struggled to maintain their authority. By around 1069 BC, the New Kingdom had effectively ended, and Egypt entered what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and foreign rule. Egypt would recover eventually. It would have great periods again in the future, but it never quite regained the position it had held during the Late Bronze Age, when it stood as one of the equal great powers of an interconnected international system. That world was gone, and even Egypt, which had survived the direct catastrophe, ended up transformed by it. Assyria is another interesting case. Because Assyria, which had been a middling power during the Late Bronze Age, actually emerged from the crisis stronger than before. This is somewhat counterintuitive. You'd think that a crisis that destroyed the Hittites and the Mycenaeans would also devastate a smaller power like Assyria. And indeed, Assyria did go through a difficult period during the 12th and 11th centuries BC, but it survived. And then in the 9th century BC, it began to expand aggressively, building what would become the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the first of the great militarized empires of the Iron Age. By the 7th century BC, Neo-Assyria would rule from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, and its power would eclipse anything the Late Bronze Age had known. The Assyrian revival is a reminder that collapse isn't the end of history. It's a punctuation mark. What comes after can be very different from what came before, and sometimes what comes after is more powerful and more ambitious than anything the earlier world had produced. But before we get to the recovery, let's talk about the actual dark period. The years and centuries immediately after the collapse, when the old world was gone and the new world hadn't yet emerged. This is a hard period to reconstruct precisely because it left so little in the way of records. But we can say a few things about what it was like. Populations were smaller, settlements were smaller, trade was more localized, political organization was much less elaborate. The elaborate craft traditions of the earlier period declined dramatically. Bronze production continued, but at a much reduced scale, and increasingly people started using iron instead. Iron had been known during the Bronze Age, but hadn't been widely used, partly because bronze was easier to work with once you had the tin, and partly because iron working technology was still developing. But iron ore is much more common than tin. You can find it almost anywhere. And in a world where the tin trade had broken down, iron became a much more practical alternative. This is why the period after the Late Bronze Age collapse is called the Iron Age. Not because iron was suddenly discovered, but because the widespread adoption of iron for tools and weapons was one of the practical responses to the collapse of the older international system. And so, we come to a curious paradox. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age was a catastrophe by every measure, yet it also set the stage for the emergence of the classical world. The Greek city-states, the Israelite and Judean kingdoms, the Phoenician trading empire, the Neo-Assyrian and later Persian empires, all of these are children of that catastrophe, born in the space it created. Let's dig deeper now into one of the most fascinating aspects of the whole story, and that's the question of the Sea Peoples themselves. Because we've been talking about them throughout, and we've said they can't be the whole explanation for the collapse, but they were certainly part of it, and their story is genuinely one of the great puzzles of ancient history. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why were they moving? And what happened to them after they arrived at the borders of Egypt and were defeated by Rameses III? Let's try to piece together what we actually know. The name Sea Peoples is a modern invention. The Egyptians didn't call them that. The Egyptians used various different names for the different groups involved, and the modern term is a scholarly convenience that groups together peoples who appear together in the Egyptian records and who seem to have been part of the same broad movement. But when you look carefully at those records, what you find is that not all the Sea Peoples were maritime. Some of them appear to have been migrating overland in ox carts with their families and their livestock. Others were arriving by sea in ships. Some of them are described as fighters, others as settlers. The whole picture is much more complex than the simple image of an invading fleet, and it suggests something more like a mass migration in which different groups with different origins had come together and were moving through the eastern Mediterranean looking for places to settle. Let's take the individual groups that Rameses names and see what we can say about each of them. The Peliset are the clearest case. Their name is essentially the same word that would later appear in the Bible as Philistines, and they settled in the coastal region of what is now Gaza and southern Israel, giving that region its ancient name of Philistia and eventually its modern name of Palestine. The archaeology of the Philistine settlements is really interesting because it shows a material culture that has strong Aegean influences. The pottery, the architecture, even some of the religious practices show connections to what had been the Mycenaean world. This has led many scholars to conclude that the Philistines, or at least the Peliset component of them, originated somewhere in the Aegean, perhaps as displaced Mycenaeans or as populations from the periphery of the Mycenaean world who moved eastward during the general chaos of the collapse. The Philistines would go on to become important players in the history of the region for several centuries, until they were eventually absorbed by the various empires that came to dominate the area. The Tejeka are less clearly identified, but they too settled somewhere along the Levantine coast, probably in what is now northern Israel. We have a rather remarkable Egyptian document called the Report of Weneman, written a century or so after the collapse, that describes an Egyptian official's journey to Byblos to buy cedar wood. And Weneman encounters the Tejeka along the way, based in a place called Dor, functioning as a maritime power in their own right. So we know they survived and established themselves as a coastal people, though we don't know a lot about their later history. The Shekelesh, the Shurden, and the Weshesh are all more mysterious. There's a long-standing theory that connects the Shekelesh with Sicily and the Shurden with Sardinia, which would mean these groups originated in the western Mediterranean. But there's another theory that goes the other way, arguing that these groups moved westward after being defeated by the Egyptians and gave their names to those islands rather than coming from them. Neither theory is really settled. The Shurden, interestingly, appear in Egyptian records both as enemies and as mercenaries. There are Shurden warriors depicted in Rameses II's army at the Battle of Kadesh, distinguished by their round shields and horned helmets. So it seems that at least some of the Shurden had already been integrated into the Egyptian military system before the Great Crisis, and continued to serve as mercenaries even as other Shurden appeared as enemies in the later reign of Rameses III. That's actually a really telling detail. It suggests that these were peoples who had been on the move for some time before the Great Collapse, that they existed on the margins of the Bronze Age system, sometimes as mercenaries and sometimes as raiders, and that the Great Crisis of 1177 wasn't so much the beginning of their movements as the culmination of a longer process. The Denian are perhaps the most tantalizing group, because their name may connect to the Danans, one of the terms Homer uses for the Greeks in the Iliad. If that connection is real, then the Denian would represent a group of Greek-speaking peoples who moved eastward during the collapse, perhaps refugees from the fall of the Mycenaean palaces. This is speculative but plausible, and it fits with what we know about the general movement of Aegean populations during this period. Some of them appear to have settled in Cyprus, where we see clear archaeological evidence of Aegean influence during and after the 12th century BC. Some may have moved further east, to Cilicia in what is now southern Turkey, where we later find a group called the Danuna in the historical record. The picture is fragmentary, but it hints at something like a Greek diaspora, driven out of the Aegean by the collapse of their home civilization and finding new homes across the eastern Mediterranean. Now here's the really interesting question. What drove these people to move in the first place? Why did they leave their homes and set out across the Mediterranean, sometimes as raiders, sometimes as settlers, sometimes as both? The traditional answer has been that they were fleeing some catastrophe of their own, some crisis in their homelands that made staying impossible. And the modern climate evidence gives us a plausible mechanism for this. The Great Drought that began around 1200 BC didn't affect only the eastern Mediterranean. It seems to have been part of a broader climate shift that affected large parts of Europe and the Near East. Populations in the Balkans, in Italy, in the Western Mediterranean, in central Anatolia, All of them may have faced their own agricultural crises, their own food shortages, their own pressure to move. And once you have populations on the move, once you have hungry armed men and their families looking for new lands to settle, the whole system starts to destabilize. Refugees become raiders. Raiders become settlers. Settlers displace other populations who become refugees in turn. It's a cascade effect, and once it starts, it can be very difficult to stop. There's also evidence that suggests the movements weren't purely reactive. Some of the Sea Peoples appear to have been organized, at least loosely, into what look like political or military coalitions. The Egyptian records describe the Sea Peoples as forming a confederation, coming together to attack Egypt as a coordinated force. That's not what refugees typically do. Refugees flee individually or in family groups. Coordinated military coalitions are the product of political organization, of leaders who can command the loyalty of large numbers of followers, of some kind of collective decision to act together. So the Sea Peoples weren't just victims of circumstance. They were also, in some sense, actors making choices, choosing to attack Egypt rather than some other target, choosing to fight rather than negotiate, choosing to move as a unified force rather than as scattered groups. Understanding them requires taking their agency seriously, not just treating them as a natural disaster that happened to strike the Bronze Age world. And this brings us to another important point about the Sea Peoples, which is that they weren't a single ethnic or linguistic group. They were a coalition, made up of different peoples from different origins who had come together for reasons we don't fully understand. In the Egyptian records, they're always described in the plural, as multiple named groups fighting alongside each other. That kind of coalition warfare is something we see elsewhere in ancient history, and it typically arises when different groups face a common problem or share a common goal. For the Sea Peoples, the common problem may have been displacement from their various homelands, and the common goal may have been finding new places to settle. Egypt was probably an obvious target, because Egypt was the wealthiest and most fertile land in the region, the place where you could most reliably find grain even in a time of general food shortage. So they came for the Nile Delta, and Rameses fought them off, and they had to go elsewhere, which is where the settlement patterns we discussed come from. They ended up in Canaan, in Cyprus, in various other places around the eastern Mediterranean, where they established themselves as best they could in the ruins of the older civilizations. Now, one of the interesting things about the Sea Peoples is what they weren't. They weren't a nomadic pastoral people like the later Arabs or Mongols. They weren't a single conquering nation like the later Assyrians or Persians. They weren't organized around a central royal court or a shared religious ideology or any of the things we typically associate with successful conquering forces. They were, essentially, migrating groups looking for land to settle. And that's actually what makes them so historically distinctive, because the pattern of migration and settlement they represent is very different from the pattern of conquest we see in later periods. They weren't trying to build an empire. They were trying to find a new home. And when they were defeated in Egypt, they didn't collapse back to their point of origin. They just kept moving until they found somewhere they could settle. That's a very human story, actually. It's the story of refugees throughout history. It just happens to have been playing out on a massive scale across the whole Eastern Mediterranean at a moment when the existing political order was already breaking down. The other thing about the Sea Peoples worth remembering is that they weren't only destructive. They also brought new cultural elements to the regions where they settled. The Philistines, for example, brought Aegean pottery styles, Aegean religious practices, and possibly Aegean political traditions to the Levantine coast. Their culture blended over time with the local Canaanite culture to produce something new, something distinctively Philistine. And this kind of cultural fusion happened in other places as well. When the older civilizations collapsed, the movements of peoples that followed didn't just destroy what had been there. They also mixed things up, brought people from different backgrounds into contact with each other, produced new cultural syntheses that would become the foundations of later societies. The Iron Age Mediterranean that emerged from the collapse was in some ways a more mixed, more cosmopolitan place than the late Bronze Age had been, even if it was also poorer and less politically sophisticated. The wanderings of the Sea Peoples were part of what produced that new world. Let's now turn to one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for understanding what happened during the late Bronze Age collapse, and that's the archaeological science that has emerged in recent decades. Because until relatively recently, our understanding of these events was based almost entirely on the textual sources and the traditional archaeological evidence, the pottery and the walls and the burn layers. But new scientific techniques have transformed our ability to reconstruct what was happening, and they've largely confirmed what many historians had suspected. Something was going wrong with the climate. The evidence comes from several different sources. Pollen analysis is one of the most important. Scientists have taken core samples from lakes and swamps across the eastern Mediterranean, and by analyzing the pollen preserved in the sediment layers, they can reconstruct what plants were growing in the region at different times in the past. And what these pollen records consistently show is a dramatic shift in vegetation beginning around 1200 BC. Species that need moisture decline. Drought-tolerant species increase. Grain crops, which required specific climate conditions to thrive, show up less frequently in the pollen record. This isn't a slight shift. It's a fundamental change in the ecological character of the region, and it lasts for centuries. When the pollen records finally show a return to wetter conditions, we're already deep into the Iron Age. Isotope analysis provides another line of evidence. Scientists can measure the ratios of different isotopes of oxygen and carbon in things like cave formations, called speleothems, and marine sediments. These ratios change depending on the temperature and rainfall of the surrounding environment. And when scientists look at speleothems from caves in the eastern Mediterranean, they find records that confirm what the pollen studies suggest. There was a significant shift toward drier and possibly cooler conditions beginning around the 12th century BC, and this shift was sustained for several hundred years. Tree ring analysis is a third technique that's been applied to this problem, though it's more difficult in the eastern Mediterranean than in some other regions because we don't have as many long-lived tree specimens to work with. But where the analysis has been possible, it too suggests periods of significant environmental stress during the relevant centuries. Combine all of this evidence, and the picture is genuinely convincing. Something substantial happened to the climate of the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, and it happened at the same time as the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. Now the question is why? What caused this climate shift? And here we get into territory that's still actively being researched. There are several hypotheses. One is that it was part of a broader natural climate fluctuation, part of the ongoing variability of the Earth's climate system. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica do suggest that there were changes in the global climate around this time, though the specific mechanisms and causes are still debated. Another hypothesis is that volcanic activity played a role. Large volcanic eruptions can inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the Earth for periods of years or even decades. There's some evidence of significant volcanic activity around this period, though whether it was severe enough to have caused the changes we see is uncertain. A third hypothesis involves changes in ocean circulation patterns, particularly in the North Atlantic, which can affect climate patterns in the Mediterranean. Whatever the specific cause, the shift itself is well documented, and its consequences for Bronze Age agriculture would have been severe. Think about what a sustained drought means for a society dependent on grain agriculture. Grain crops need a specific amount of rainfall at specific times of the year. If the rains come too late, the crops don't germinate properly. If they don't come enough, the plants wither before they can produce grain. And unlike modern industrial agriculture, Bronze Age agriculture had very limited buffers against these variations. There was no irrigation infrastructure of the kind that later societies would develop. There were no drought-resistant crop varieties bred specifically for arid conditions. There were storage facilities, yes, and the palace granaries could hold significant reserves, but those reserves were designed to cushion against occasional bad years. not against a sustained shift in the climate lasting decades or centuries. Once the reserves were depleted, there was nothing to fall back on. And the historical evidence tells us that the reserves were indeed depleted during the late 13th century BC. That letter from the Egyptian pharaoh promising to keep the land of Hatti alive with grain shipments comes from exactly this period, and it tells us that the Hittites, one of the great powers of the age, could no longer feed themselves from their own agriculture. And when a society can't feed itself, all sorts of things start to happen. Political legitimacy erodes because the fundamental promise of the palace system that the king would ensure food security is broken. Social hierarchies break down because when people are starving, they don't respect the demands of distant rulers. Migration increases as people leave marginal lands for places where they think they can find food. Conflict increases as different groups compete for scarce resources, and these effects can cascade. Migration puts pressure on the areas that receive the migrants, which can trigger secondary migrations. Conflict destroys agricultural infrastructure, making the food situation worse. Political collapse in one area disrupts trade networks, spreading the crisis to areas that weren't directly affected by the drought. This is exactly the pattern we see in the late Bronze Age collapse. It's not just that individual societies failed. It's that the failure of some societies fed into and accelerated the failure of others. Now let's talk about another factor that we haven't discussed much yet, which is what we might call the fragility of complexity. This is an idea that some historians and anthropologists have developed to explain why complex societies sometimes collapse catastrophically rather than gradually. The basic idea is this: complex societies solve problems by developing more complex solutions, and each new solution requires the maintenance of infrastructure and specialized personnel that make the whole system more elaborate over time. Building a road solves the problem of transporting goods, but it requires maintenance. Creating a bureaucracy to manage grain distribution solves the problem of feeding urban populations, but it requires scribes and administrators and record-keeping systems. Developing long-distance trade networks solves the problem of accessing raw materials, but it requires ships and sailors and merchants and diplomats and treaties with foreign powers. Each of these solutions works well when the system is functioning smoothly, but each of them adds to the total complexity of the society, and each of them requires ongoing investment to maintain. And here's the key point: there are diminishing returns to complexity. The first road you build produces enormous benefits. The 10th road, less so. The 100th road, even less. At some point, you're spending more resources maintaining your existing infrastructure than you're getting back in benefits. And when you reach that point, the society becomes vulnerable to any external shock that reduces its ability to keep paying for its own maintenance. A drought that reduces agricultural output. An invasion that disrupts trade. An epidemic that reduces the labor force. Any of these can push a complex society past its breaking point, at which point the whole elaborate structure starts to unravel. Not because any single component of it has failed, but because the society can no longer afford to maintain all of it simultaneously. Choices have to be made about what to keep and what to let go, and the choices themselves undermine the system further. The late Bronze Age civilizations were, by the standards of their time, extremely complex. They had elaborate palace administrations. They had specialized craft production. They had extensive trade networks that depended on long-distance transportation and diplomatic coordination. They had large populations concentrated in urban centers that depended on rural food production. And all of this was, in a sense, being paid for by the surplus generated by their agricultural economies. As long as the agricultural surplus was sufficient, the whole system could keep functioning. But when the surplus started to shrink, whether because of drought or population pressure or something else, the maintenance costs of the complex system became unsustainable. And when the maintenance costs became unsustainable, the system started to break down. You can see this happening in the documentary evidence from the late 13th century BC. The letters we have from the Hittite court in this period are full of complaints about problems that in earlier centuries wouldn't have been problems at all. Grain shipments are late. Officials aren't performing their duties. Provincial governors are ignoring orders from the capital. Merchants are being attacked by bandits on the roads. Coastal cities are being raided by pirates. None of these problems individually is fatal, but they all point to a system that is starting to lose its grip on itself. The center is unable to enforce its will on the periphery. The infrastructure that supported the elaborate imperial administration is starting to fray. And when the great crisis finally arrives, the system has already been weakened to the point where it can't respond effectively. Compare that with what happened in Egypt. Egypt survived the immediate crisis of 1177 BC, but Egypt was in some ways a simpler and more centralized society than the Hittite Empire. Egyptian civilization was built around the Nile, which provided a reliable water supply regardless of what was happening in the eastern Mediterranean. The Nile flood is fed by rains in the Ethiopian highlands, which weren't directly affected by the same climate shift that was drying out the Levant and Anatolia. So Egyptian agriculture continued to function even when everyone else's was failing. And Egyptian political organization was concentrated around a strong central authority in the person of the pharaoh, without the same web of provincial vassals and coalition partners that the Hittites had depended on. When the Sea Peoples arrived, Rameses III could concentrate his forces in the Nile Delta and fight a decisive battle, because his kingdom was compact and organized around a single power center. The Hittites, by contrast, would have had to defend a much larger territory with a much more decentralized political structure, and that was probably part of why they failed. But even Egypt, having survived the immediate crisis, went into a long, slow decline afterward. Because Egypt was still part of the broader Bronze Age system, still depended to some extent on trade and diplomatic relationships with other kingdoms, and once those kingdoms collapsed, Egypt lost partners and markets that it had come to rely on. The bronze that Egyptian craftsmen needed became harder to get because the tin trade had broken down. The luxury goods that Egyptian elites had used to display their status became harder to obtain because the international trade networks that had delivered them had unraveled. Egypt survived, but Egypt was diminished. And the diminished Egypt of the late New Kingdom was a much less dynamic and much less influential society than the Egypt that had entered the late Bronze Age at its peak. Let's now think about the long-term consequences of the collapse, because in some ways, this is the most important part of the whole story. What did the world look like after everything had fallen apart, and what did that new world eventually become? Because as I mentioned earlier, the collapse wasn't the end of history. It was a punctuation mark, a moment of enormous disruption, but human societies continued to exist and to develop, and what emerged on the other side of the Dark Age was in many ways more consequential than what had come before. The most obvious immediate consequence was the loss of civilizational complexity across huge parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. In Greece, as we've discussed, the Mycenaean palace system was gone and wouldn't be replaced by anything comparable for 4 centuries. The population declined dramatically. Urban settlement essentially disappeared. Writing vanished from Greek lands entirely. When the light finally comes back on, sometime around the 8th century BC, it's a completely different Greek world we're looking at. There's a new alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians. There are new political forms, the emerging city-states, or polis, that would eventually produce classical Greek civilization. There's a new poetic tradition, most famously represented by Homer, that looks back at the lost world of the Bronze Age as a mythic age of heroes. And there's a new religious tradition, centered on the Olympic gods, that has clear continuities with the earlier Mycenaean religion, but also many new elements. This new Greek world would go on to produce democracy, philosophy, drama, and the whole intellectual heritage that would shape Western civilization for the next several thousand years. But it emerged from 4 centuries of darkness, during which most of what the Mycenaeans had built was simply forgotten. In Anatolia, the story is similar. The Hittite Empire was gone and would never return. The central Anatolian plateau entered its own dark age, during which population declined and urban settlement collapsed. When the region re-emerges into the historical record, It's populated by peoples the Greeks would call the Phrygians, whose material culture and language have almost no connection to what came before. The great Hittite hieroglyphic writing system survived in some of the peripheral Neo-Hittite states for a few centuries, but eventually it too disappeared, and the memory of the Hittite Empire faded so completely that it wasn't until 19th century archaeology rediscovered them that we even knew they had existed. The Bible mentions Hittites, but the biblical Hittites are shadowy figures, remembered only as one of several groups of Canaanites, with no hint of the great empire they had once ruled. That's the level of forgetting we're talking about. An entire imperial civilization, wiped from historical memory so thoroughly that its very existence had to be reconstructed by modern scholars 3,000 years later. In the Levant, the story is more complicated because there were more survivors and more continuity. The Phoenician cities, as I mentioned, actually thrived after the collapse, gradually rebuilding maritime trade networks that would eventually extend across the entire Mediterranean. The Phoenician alphabet, developed from earlier Canaanite writing systems, would spread to the Greeks and eventually to everyone else, becoming the ancestor of most alphabetic writing in the world today. In the highlands, the Israelites and their neighbors were developing the small kingdoms that would eventually produce the religious and literary traditions we know from the Hebrew Bible. In the plains, the Philistines were establishing their coastal cities and their distinctive material culture. All of this was happening in what had been the periphery of the late Bronze Age system, and it emerged in the space created by the collapse of the older Canaanite city-states. Further east, in Mesopotamia, the collapse was less total but still significant. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon fell around 1155 BC, ending a period of Kassite rule that had lasted for over 4 centuries. The city of Babylon continued to exist, but its regional dominance was reduced, and Mesopotamia entered a period of political fragmentation and reduced cultural output. Assyria, as I mentioned earlier, went through its own difficult period, but survived, and eventually emerged in the 9th century BC as a rising imperial power that would come to dominate the entire ancient Near East. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which reached its peak in the 7th century BC, ruled from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, and its military and administrative innovations set the pattern for all subsequent empires in the region. So Mesopotamia went from being one of several great powers in the late Bronze Age to becoming, for a period, the center of the largest empire the world had yet seen. That's a significant transformation, and it was made possible in part by the elimination of the older competitors during the late Bronze Age collapse. And then there's the transition from bronze to iron. This is one of the most important long-term consequences of the collapse, and it deserves careful thought. As I mentioned earlier, the Bronze Age depended on the trade of tin and copper across long distances, and when those trade networks broke down, bronze became scarcer and more expensive. In response, people turned increasingly to iron, which had been known during the Bronze Age but hadn't been widely used. Iron ore is much more abundant than tin or copper, but iron is harder to work with. It requires higher temperatures to smelt, and it needs to be worked at higher temperatures than bronze. But once you develop the technology to work iron effectively, you have a metal that's both more abundant and, when properly processed, harder and more durable than bronze. So the transition to iron wasn't just a substitution for bronze. It was a fundamental shift in the material basis of civilization, and this shift had enormous consequences. When bronze was the primary metal, the ability to produce weapons and tools was concentrated in the hands of elites who could afford to buy or command the expensive raw materials. Bronze warfare tended to be dominated by aristocratic warriors, equipped with expensive bronze weapons and armor, exactly the kind of Mycenaean or Hittite warrior aristocracy we see in the late Bronze Age. But once iron became widely available, weapons and tools could be produced much more cheaply and in much larger quantities. Ordinary farmers could afford iron plows. Ordinary soldiers could be equipped with iron swords. The whole military and economic basis of society shifted toward mass production and mass participation. And this shift is one of the reasons why the classical civilizations that emerged from the Iron Age look so different from their Bronze Age predecessors. The Greek city-states with their citizen armies of hoplites, the Roman legions with their standardized equipment, the great mass armies of the ancient Near Eastern empires, all of these were made possible by the widespread availability of iron. The late Bronze Age collapse, by breaking the tin trade and forcing the transition to iron, set the stage for a fundamentally different kind of society. There are also religious and cultural consequences worth thinking about. The collapse of the palace civilizations meant the collapse of the religious institutions associated with them. The elaborate temple complexes of the Bronze Age, the priesthoods that served them, the ritual traditions they maintained, all of this was disrupted or destroyed during the collapse. And what emerged in the Iron Age was often quite different. In Greece, the Olympic religion of the classical period preserved elements of Mycenaean religion, but reorganized them around new institutions, new sanctuaries, new rituals. In the Levant, the emergence of Israelite religion, with its distinctive monotheistic emphasis, took place against the backdrop of the collapse of the older Canaanite religious traditions. Whether Israelite monotheism developed as a direct response to the collapse of the polytheistic city-state religions, or whether it emerged for other reasons and simply took shape during the same period, is a question scholars still debate. But there's no doubt that the disruption caused by the collapse created space for new religious ideas to develop, and some of those ideas would prove enormously consequential for later history. Think about it this way. The three great monotheistic religions of the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace their roots ultimately back to the religious developments that took place in the Iron Age Levant. And those developments took place in the specific historical context created by the collapse of the late Bronze Age civilizations. Without the collapse of the Egyptian and Canaanite palace systems in the region, without the emergence of the small Israelite kingdoms in the highlands, without the specific cultural and religious ferment of the Iron Age, the religious traditions that would shape the subsequent history of half the world might have developed very differently, or might not have developed at all. That's not to say the collapse caused monotheism in any direct sense, but it created the historical conditions in which monotheism could emerge and thrive. That's a pretty enormous long-term consequence for what might otherwise be seen as a purely political and economic catastrophe. And then there's the question of political forms. The late Bronze Age world was dominated by palace kingdoms, centered on god-kings and their bureaucracies. What emerged in the Iron Age was, in many places, something quite different. In Greece, we see the emergence of the polis, the city-state with its citizen assemblies and its shared civic institutions. In Rome, eventually, we see the emergence of the res publica, the public thing, with its senate and its elected magistrates. Neither of these developments is a direct consequence of the Bronze Age collapse, but both of them take place in a world that has been reshaped by the collapse, in societies that no longer have the palace civilizations of the Bronze Age as their primary model of political organization. The break with the older order created space for new experiments in political organization, some of which would eventually produce the democratic and republican traditions that would shape modern politics. None of this is to say that the collapse was a good thing. It clearly wasn't. Enormous numbers of people died. Enormous amounts of cultural achievement were lost. Populations lived through misery and terror on a scale that we can barely imagine. If you could ask a Mycenaean grandmother in 1180 BC whether she thought the collapse was worth it because someday it might make possible the emergence of democracy and monotheism, she would presumably think you were mad. She would want her grandchildren to grow up in peace and prosperity in the world she had known, not to be scattered across the Mediterranean as refugees while their homeland turned back into wilderness. The collapse was a tragedy from the perspective of those who lived through it. But history has a way of building new things on the ruins of old things, and the world that eventually emerged from the Iron Age Dark Age was very different from the world that had come before, and in some ways more consequential. Let's now step back and try to draw all of this together, because we've covered an enormous amount of ground. and the mystery we started with deserves a proper conclusion. Or as proper a conclusion as history can give us, which is to say, one that admits how much we still don't know while trying to say something meaningful about what we do. The late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the great puzzles of ancient history, and it's likely to remain so. There's no smoking gun that we can point to and say, this is what did it. There's no single cause that historians and archaeologists have been able to agree on. What we have instead is a picture of a world that fell apart under the pressure of multiple simultaneous crises, each of which reinforced the others, until the whole elaborate structure of Bronze Age civilization came unraveled. Drought, migration, earthquake, invasion, internal social conflict, systemic economic disruption. All of these things were happening at once, and it's the combination that overwhelmed the ability of these societies to respond and recover. And this is actually, I think, one of the most important lessons the late Bronze Age collapse has to teach us, because we tend to think of civilizational collapse as something that happens because of a single dramatic cause. A great invasion, a great plague, a great war. But real historical collapses tend to be more like what we see in 1177 BC. They're the result of multiple stresses acting simultaneously on complex systems that lack the resilience to absorb them all. The problem isn't any single cause. The problem is the accumulation of causes, the way each one makes the others worse, the way a society that could easily have handled any one of them individually finds itself unable to handle all of them together. That's a pattern that recurs throughout history, and it may have implications for our own time, though I'll be cautious about drawing too direct a parallel because the ancient world was in many ways very different from ours. But think about it. The late Bronze Age world was, in its own terms, extraordinarily interconnected. Its great kingdoms depended on each other for raw materials, for luxury goods, for diplomatic and political stability. When one part of the system started to fail, the effects rippled outward and destabilized everything. When several parts of the system started to fail simultaneously, the whole thing came down. Now, our modern world is also extraordinarily interconnected, in ways that would have astonished any Bronze Age king. Our economies depend on global supply chains, on international trade, on complex financial systems that link every corner of the planet. Our societies depend on sophisticated infrastructure that requires continuous maintenance, on specialized expertise that takes decades to develop, on political and legal institutions that took centuries to build. All of this makes us wealthier than any previous civilization has been, but it also makes us potentially vulnerable in ways we don't fully understand. The late Bronze Age didn't fall because its inhabitants were stupid or incompetent. It fell because it was complex, and complex systems can fail in complex ways. That's worth remembering without being alarmist about it. But let me not turn this into a lesson lecture. Let me finish instead by returning to the human dimension, because that's ultimately what history is about. The people who lived through the late Bronze Age collapse were people like us. They had families and hopes and fears and daily routines. They loved their children and worried about the future and complained about the weather. And they lived through the collapse of their world. Not because they had done anything wrong, not because their civilization was somehow doomed by moral failure or divine judgment, but because they happened to be alive during a period of history when circumstances turned against them. Bad things happened, and they had to deal with those bad things as best they could. Many of them died. Many of them lost everything they had. Many of them ended their days as refugees in strange lands, or as subsistence farmers in ruined countrysides, or as slaves in kingdoms far from their homelands. That's a hard truth about history. Sometimes people just have to endure catastrophes they didn't cause and couldn't prevent, and there's no meaning or lesson in it beyond the simple fact of human resilience in the face of hardship. But the human story of the collapse isn't only tragic. Because those same people, or their children and grandchildren, went on to build new things. They founded new cities. They developed new technologies. They created new religions and new political systems and new cultural traditions. Some of them, without knowing it, laid the foundations for civilizations that would flourish thousands of years later. The Phoenicians, who developed the alphabet that would eventually give us all the writing systems of Europe. The Israelites in their highland villages who would eventually produce the religious traditions that would shape half the world. The Greek villagers who would eventually produce Homer and Athens and democracy. All of these people were the descendants of the survivors of the late Bronze Age collapse, working with what they had, building slowly out of the rubble the foundations of the classical world. That's the other side of the human story. Not just the misery of the collapse, but the persistence of human creativity and adaptability afterwards. People kept living, people kept building, people kept dreaming of better futures, and eventually, over the course of centuries, they got there. Now let me end with a thought about how we know what we know. Because the late Bronze Age collapse is a story that's been reconstructed by generations of scholars, working with fragments and clues and educated guesses, piecing together what happened from what has survived. The Egyptian inscriptions on the walls of Medinet Habu, the clay tablets baked hard in the fires of Ugarit, the archaeological layers of destruction at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos, the scientific data from pollen cores and ice cores and cave formations. All of these things had to be found, deciphered, interpreted, and integrated into a coherent narrative, and that work took, and is still taking, generations of scholars from around the world. The mystery of 1177 BC isn't solved. It may never be fully solved. But we know vastly more about it now than anyone did 100 years ago, and it's likely that in another 100 years scholars will know things we can't currently imagine, using techniques we haven't yet developed to answer questions we haven't yet asked. That's the nature of historical understanding. It's always provisional, always incomplete, always subject to revision as new evidence comes to light. And that's part of what makes it so fascinating. The story of the past isn't fixed. It's constantly being rewritten as we learn more, and every generation of scholars gets to add their own chapter to the ongoing project of trying to understand where we came from. If you'd like to explore this topic further, there's a lot of good material out there. Eric Klein's book, which is called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, is a great starting point for a general reader. It gives an accessible overview of the collapse and the various theories that have been proposed to explain it, and it's the book that popularized the specific date of 1177 as a way of thinking about the whole event. But there are many other scholars who have written on this period, and the field is genuinely active, with new discoveries and new arguments appearing regularly. If ancient history interests you, this is one of the great open questions of the discipline, and there's plenty of room for further investigation. And I think that's actually a nice note to end on, because the story of the late Bronze Age collapse isn't a closed story. It's an ongoing story, an ongoing investigation, and every one of us who reads about it or thinks about it is participating in that investigation in some small way. The past isn't dead. It's still with us, in the questions it poses to us, in the lessons it might teach us, in the simple wonder of trying to understand people who lived thousands of years ago in worlds so different from our own. Whether we're talking about the medieval poor of London or the collapsing kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, we're talking about human beings whose lives had meaning and whose stories are worth remembering. And in remembering them, we do them a kind of honor. We acknowledge that they existed, that they mattered, that their triumphs and tragedies weren't just events in some abstract historical record, but real experiences of real people. That's what history is for in the end. Not to give us lessons, though it sometimes does. Not to entertain us, though it sometimes does that too. But to remind us of the vast human family we belong to, of the long chain of ancestors whose lives made our lives possible, of the sheer strangeness and richness of the human experience across time and place. The world of 1177 BC was so different from ours that we can barely imagine it. And yet the people in it were people, with all the complexity and depth and dignity that people have always had. The kings of Ugarit writing their desperate letters as the enemy's ships approached. The farmers of Anatolia watching their crops fail year after year. The refugees moving across the Mediterranean looking for new homes. The bronze smiths who saw their trade become obsolete as iron took over. The mothers who buried their children in graves that archaeologists would open 3,000 years later. All of them were real. All of them had inner lives. All of them experienced the great catastrophe of their age in their own individual ways. And thinking about them, imagining their lives, trying to understand what they went through, that's what makes ancient history worth doing. Not because it gives us answers to our own problems, but because it enlarges our sense of what it means to be human. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the great mystery of 1177 BC. It's a story I find endlessly fascinating, and I hope you've enjoyed exploring it with me. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, please do give this video a like, drop a comment letting me know what you thought, and subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, if you're one of the very fine people supporting the channel financially, keeping us ad-free and beholden to nobody but you good folk in the audience, thank you again. It means the world. Anyway, that's the end of this one. Good night and farewell. Peace.